Hi everyone, welcome to my home. I am Victoria Wilder, author of Lullaby of the Lilitu, and it is around 4:30 in the morning here in New York, and I figured I would like to read to you guys. I know I'm not the only person in the world who stays up this late or who is up on YouTube in the middle of the day in another country, another time zone, Um, and since a lot of us are isolated and just, I guess, having to stay at home, I thought reading a story would be cool because stories have always been very important to me. Stories have always kind of helped me understand the world. And so, I guess just relax. I'm only going to read for about an hour. I'm not going to try to read the whole book in one night. And this is my first time doing this, and I'm very nervous, but hopefully it turns out okay. Hopefully you guys can hear me, and I'm not too quiet. And hopefully this is something you enjoy. I always like having stories read to me, or listening to tellings of stories. And so I thought during this time that could be something I offer. This is in no way going to be professional or sound like the official audiobook whenever that comes around. This is just me late at night um, reading. So I am going to turn off the light here, and you guys can just look at the candle, and I'm going to use my book light. So this is Lullaby of the Lilitu, and I haven't read it pretty much since I published it, so I've looked through it, but December 13th, 2012. Noire Lorette tossed a bundle of lavender and motherwort into her new fireplace and settled back onto the couch, relishing the aromatic warmth. She smiled as her daughter led a pack of stampeding 8-year-olds into her bedroom. They had just demolished a tub of strawberry ice cream and an entire birthday cake. She supposed they were going to go work off the sugar rush. Noire snuggled into the couch and cracked open the latest West Steel steamy romance. Her husband, Marcel, cleaned in the kitchen, collecting the remnants of a horse-adorned wrapping paper and plastic forks and shoving them into a white garbage bag. The family of 3 had lived in the Irish town of Oranmore for a few weeks. After years of running, it already felt like home. Their daughter was making friends at school, though she'd never had any trouble with that. Noire and Marcel had both landed jobs at the local pub. She tended bar, he cooked. Once or twice a week, their boss let her take breaks to read cards in the corner for curious customers. She was beginning to love this little place. Burning heat spread across her chest and tapered into a tightening in her belly. The book clunked against the wooden floor. She gasped, trying to call for her husband, but her voice came no louder than a whisper. In the next moment, her body stiffened and her eyes rolled upwards until the white orbs beneath reflected the flame in the fireplace. She gripped the couch, resisting the electric convulsions tearing through her body. Marcel ran to her. Noire. He grabbed her shoulders and turned her onto her side, stroking her hair until her breathing slowed and she stopped quaking. When he looked up, he saw his daughter standing behind the couch. She stared at him with the same glazed look that overcame Noire's eyes after every episode. After pressing his fingers against Noire's pulse for a beat and assuring himself she was stable, he scooped his daughter into his arms. She shivered, covered in sweat, with tears pouring down her round cheeks. The bottom half of her pajamas were soaked through with urine. The other girls poked their heads out of the little bedroom down the hall. "It's okay, girls." Marcel tried to keep his voice pleasant as he spoke in his best English. They must have been frightened when the seizure hit both mother and daughter. The girls' episodes weren't as violent as Noir's, but they weren't by any means pleasant. The little one in his arms remained silent, as she always did afterward, and he affected a smile for the girls. "Sometimes they get a little sick, but they're going to be fine. Go on and play, and I'll call you when dinner's ready." The girls went back into the bedroom, but they stayed quiet. He sat on the couch and wiped moisture from his wife's forehead while still cradling the small girl. With his other hand, he stroked the beaded braids on her head. She gazed into the fireplace, its flames reflecting in her deep brown irises. Her voice barely a whisper, she said, "Don't use it, Daddy." Marcel followed her gaze to the wide silver blade glinting beside the fireplace, the old machete he kept near at all times. He looked into the small girl's eyes. "Do you remember what happened, sweetheart?" She shook her head, but her tears told him otherwise. He squeezed his daughter to him. He hated watching her go through these episodes, but there was nothing he could do to help her, just as he could never help Noir. After a few moments, Noir lifted her head. She groaned as she pushed herself up and gazed at her husband and daughter. Without a word, she pulled the trembling girl into her arms and stared at the fire in silence until Marcel reached for her hand. She jumped. She'd forgotten he was there. "We can't stay here." She shook her head as though to clear it of whatever she'd seen. "Tell the girls we aren't feeling well. Call their parents. We leave tomorrow." She stood and carried her daughter towards the master bedroom. At the door, she stopped and looked back at the home they'd come to love. Noir shrugged and took her daughter into the room. She changed and laid the now sleeping girl down, then pulled her old, worn suitcase out of the closet. Back in the living room, Marcel stared at the door Noir had just passed through. She would tell him what she saw once the house was clear and the girls sent home. Until then, the all-too-familiar anxiety gnawed at him. Their daughter's visions had started a year ago. Noir endured the episodes her whole life, but it didn't help her protect their child. The visions nearly traumatized the girl each time they came. They always struck mother and daughter at the same time, as though the two picked up messages on the same psychic radio channel. But from what little they could gather, as the girl hated talking about them, their daughter's visions seemed different from Noir's. He turned his attention to the task of clearing the house. He corralled the visiting girls and called their parents, offering hearty apologies and assuring them that what ailed his family wasn't contagious. Once the last child left, he headed for the kitchen to clean and make sandwiches for travel. He stopped as a loud knocking came through the door. Was a girl still hiding somewhere in the house? He thought he'd gathered them all in the living room, but maybe one had given him the slip. He wasn't focused at the time. He peeked into his daughter's room once more. When he was sure no children remained hidden, he peered through the small hole in the front door. A tall man in a blue velvet suit waited outside. He adjusted the old-fashioned brooch at his collar, a small metal bauble with a 7-pointed star engraved in its center, and knocked again. Marcel didn't recognize him. He reached for the doorknob. "Don't open the door!" Noir grabbed her husband's hand, but it was too late. The door swung back and a large grin spread across the stranger's face. He straightened the ruffled cuffs peeking out from under his bell-shaped sleeves, before bending forward in a sweeping bow. "Noir, how nice to finally meet you." He spoke in an old French dialect, one that had gone out of common use centuries ago, but Noir understood perfectly. Noir raised a palm to her face and blew white powder in the direction of the door. A yellow light passed across the doorway, and the stranger took a step back. He chuckled, his voice rich and low, almost a growl, and he looked up at her from under thick, black lashes. His eyes flashed like emeralds catching fire as he raised one hand and stepped forward through the doorway. The barrier hissed where it touched his skin and covered his flesh with tiny pustules which faded the instant he broke through. Marcel and Noir looked at each other, eyes wide. The stranger grinned and sauntered towards the living room. "I do not come to harm you," he said, leaning back against the couch. "I come with an offer." Marcel stepped in front of his wife, his muscles tensed. "We want nothing from you." "Don't you want to know who I am?" The stranger grinned at Marcel. Noir grabbed Marcel's hand and replied in the old language, "We know who you are, and you know the Vagari people want nothing to do with Lilitu." "The Vagari are no more. Besides, don't you want to save your daughter?" The stranger pouted his lips. He smirked at the couple and surveyed the small living room. Noir and Marcel exchanged a look. Noir stepped forward. "We will protect our daughter, especially from your kind." "You won't." The stranger's voice hitched as he dug his nails into the back of the couch. "The two coming for her are far worse than I. They will rip you and her to shreds. Frankly, you're already more trouble than you're worth, but I won't let them have her." A knot formed in Noir's stomach, and she fought back a wave of nausea. She shuddered as the vision replayed in her mind. "Leave us." She looked at her husband and softened her voice. "Whoever's coming, let us fend them off ourselves." The dark stranger laughed and pushed himself off the couch. "You are a fool, young Vagari. Your weak magics will do little to stop ones as old as they, and they won't stop me." He sighed. 1,000 years ago, your people were far more agreeable." He gazed into Noir's eyes. The green and gold irises of his own swirled and shimmered. "You will hear me, Noir Lurette. In your heart of hearts, you know my words to be true. You and your family will come live on my private island, and I will keep all of you safe." Noir spit. "We are warded from your eye, abomination. Now go." The stranger's jaw clenched, but he smiled and tilted his head, looking over Noir's shoulder. He waved, wiggling his fingers. Noir turned to see her daughter's little head peeking out of the bedroom, and her chest tightened. She couldn't let this monster near her child. She ran back and scooped the girl into her arms and into the room, slamming the door behind them. "It's okay, petite," she whispered, rubbing the child's shoulders. The girl snuggled in her lap as Noir sat on the edge of the bed. She rocked back and forth, humming a tune into her daughter's ears. She began to sing the soft folk tune her mother and grandmother had sung to her whenever she'd had a particularly frightening vision. Now she sang it to her child in feverish repetition, praying as she did that it would imprint itself on the girl's subconscious. Quand elle est sommeil, le monde est calme. Quand elle se réveille, les rideaux se ferment. Le soleil mord pour les dieux, comme le feu brûle sa soul. Outside, Marcel's heated voice told the visitor again to leave. The two men stood in the middle of the small living room. They circled each other now, both taking slow, careful steps. "I am trying to reason with you, you stupid animal." The stranger sneered and bared his teeth. 6 thin, pointed teeth protruded from his gums. Marcel leapt over the couch and grabbed the silver machete. He swung it over his head and in a quick display of skill brought it down with a vicious swoop, aiming for the visitor's head. The blade whistled through the air as Marcel looked up to find his target gone. He spun around and a hand gripped his throat, lifting him off his feet. The stranger threw Marcel across the room and through the kitchen wall. In a flash of impossible speed, he stood over Marcel and pressed his foot to his chest. "Pray to me," the visitor growled. Marcel groaned as the foot on his chest pushed into him. Blood pooled into his lungs, exploding from his mouth. He coughed, spitting at the beast above him. The stranger sneered. Marcel's ribs cracked, crushed under the inhuman strength, and he screamed, the gurgling scream of a poor soul drowning in his own blood. His screams carried across the small house, and Noir jumped into action. She wrapped her daughter in a thick winter coat and pulled the girl to the window. "Listen to me, petite," she said, rubbing her girl's shoulders with trembling hands. "You must run far away from here. Go to the river and call for Lucinda Barlow." "But, maman—" "Go now." She embraced the girl before lifting her up and through the window. She waved her away, took one last look, and ran out of the room. When she turned to run for the door, the stranger appeared centimeters in front of her face, causing her to skid to a stop. Noir raised her chin to look him in the eye. "She will never be yours. She'll remember us, and she'll stop you." Her voice wavered, but she narrowed her eyes and planted her feet. "I see." A brief smile flashed across his face before he lunged forward and plunged his teeth into Noir's throat. He pulled her down and drank until the light flickered from her eyes. When he finished, he snapped a silk handkerchief from his pocket and dabbed at the blood around his mouth. He dropped the handkerchief onto Noir's lifeless body as he sauntered out. "I suppose I'll have to change her mind." Change angles here. Give me a sec. January 9th, 2034. One. The air hissed with an ear-splitting whistle that cut through the foggy darkness. At first I saw nothing. My eyes darted through the vibrating black of the room. A bedroom. Names and words floated to the surface of an empty chasm void of memory. Books on shelves, silky bed sheets beneath me, dolls lining the wall across from me, and the voice I had heard before spoke to me. "Good morning." I rose to sit. My bones ached with a stiffness as a dry cough erupted like fire from my lungs and my flesh burned. I could feel him watching me. "I'm sorry to disturb you like this, but I couldn't wait. I came as soon as I felt you awaken." My head snapped to the right, and my eyes focused on the beautiful man watching me from a massive green chair. My heart thumped loud against my chest. I couldn't bring myself to meet his gaze, but I knew he was staring as I took him in. He sat with his arms resting on his spread knees, leaning forward. Pink gold and bejeweled rings cluttered his long, golden-brown fingers on hands that seemed too large for his lean body. My eyes made their way up his dark, tailored suit and ruffled collar. Gold chains twisted in and out of the silken folds, dangling with various pendants, jewels, and talismans. He was glory. A name floated out of the darkness. "Kyan?" I said. He smiled and leaned back in the chair. "Look into my eyes." I did. I couldn't resist even if I wanted to, and I was transported into a pool of green and gold, like an autumn leaf suspended in the purest liquid crystal. I fell deeper and deeper into the pool, forgetting any momentary fear or shock. "Do you love me?" His voice echoed through me, sending ripples into my every cell. I could feel myself nodding, but it was as though my mind had gone off to swim in his eyes. Do you trust me? Again I felt myself nodding, swimming further away from my body with each question. Are you mine forever? From somewhere far away I heard a faint yes and knew it was my own voice. I jolted back into my body, suddenly cold and shivering. Cayenne towered over me, a dark angel. With his hair pulled back into a tight bun, he looked at me from under thick, dark brows and smiled. That'll do. He reached inside a bag I hadn't noticed beside me and pulled out a thin, extending pole. It looked like an IV setup, and a few other tools I didn't recognize. They glinted in silver with little leather-wrapped handles. I began to rise, and Cayenne placed a hand on my shoulder, willing me not to move. Don't worry. I'm going to draw a little of your blood to run some tests. It won't hurt. It was true. I barely felt the needle pierce my arm. I watched the needle sizzle against my skin. The blood traveled up the plastic tube, thick and bright red, on its way to the solution bag. A dark, almost maroon aura glowed around it. He was taking a pint of my blood, and I was letting him, though I couldn't say why. I focused on following the fluid's path and could feel his eyes boring into me. My heart pounded again, sending warmth to my cheeks and pumping more thick blood into the IV. I sat, a mute statue under his scrutiny, pinned to the bed and almost vibrating with an intense emotion I couldn't name, threatening to explode from my veins. When the bag bulged, ready to pop, he took it from the pole and put away his tools. I watched his hands work as I fought a surge of nausea and dizziness. He placed a finger under my chin, lifted my head, and surveyed my face. After a moment, he nodded and reached into his leather bag. His hand emerged with a rattling pill bottle from which he poured 2 pills into my palm. I blinked dumbly at the tiny pink tablets. Little round discs inscribed on one side with the letters E, D, S, and on the other with a 7-pointed star in the middle of a circle. Take them, he said. Without a moment of hesitation, I tossed the pills into my mouth and swallowed them dry. My body wasn't in my control, yet somehow I didn't mind. Cayenne was pleased with me, and in that moment I cared about nothing else. He placed a heavy hand on my head, and I briefly wondered if his jewelry would get caught in my hair. He leaned over and kissed my forehead. Rest now, sweet girl. With that, he grabbed his bag and walked towards the door. He was leaving me. The heavy, dazed feeling weighing me down lightened, and my limbs moved in slow, painful bursts as I threw my weight to the floor and crawled towards him. He regarded me with a raised eyebrow as I dragged myself on my forearms across the cold stone floors, my legs too heavy to move. I didn't care how much time passed. I didn't care how humiliatingly desperate I appeared. The thought of not being with him was unbearable. I pulled myself towards him, aching to touch him. My arms slammed against the floor, my skin pulled tight, threatening to peel. The pain circulating throughout my body did not compare to the fear of Cayenne leaving me alone in that room. He leaned against the wall, crossing his arms. He smiled and waited for me to reach him. The closer I got, the bigger his smile grew. Tears stung my eyes as pain and fear mingled. Desperation spilled from me in heavy sobs. He sank to the floor as I neared, and when I got close enough, held out his hands toward me. I grasped it, and in one swift motion he lifted me into his arms. He walked back to the bed and sat, holding me on his lap as I wept against his chest. Safe. I was safe in the warmth of his embrace. If he let me go, I thought I might die. Instead, he rubbed my sore arms. His cool hand soothed and caressed me as I breathed him in. He smelled like the ocean. My excellent, sweet girl. He whispered into my hair as he held me, massaging my tender flesh. He sighed, closing his eyes as he squeezed me. You needn't worry, my child. I won't ever leave you. Am I your child? Oh, yes. You are my daughter. I looked at him. We didn't exactly look alike. I placed my hand in his. Even in the darkened room, I could see the contrast of his golden skin to my much deeper brown. And even though my hand fit as small as a child's in his, I knew I wasn't one. I tilted my head back to inspect his smooth, youthful face. Aren't you too young to be my father? How old are you? How old am I? It hadn't occurred to me before this moment that I knew nothing about Cayenne other than his name, more than I knew about myself. He chuckled. I am older than I look, darling girl. But now we have business. I almost forgot to give you a name. I scrunched my nose. How can I not have a name? Look at me, fully grown. Why is it I remember nothing before tonight? Athena sprung from her father's head, a full-grown woman. She didn't ask Zeus what she was before, what tools he used to mold her. He furrowed his brow, his voice taking on a slight edge. I felt chastised and tried to change the subject. You said you had to give me a name, Cayenne. Call me Papa. He softened. What would you like to be named? A jumble of names rose in my mind, but none sounded right. I searched around the room and my eyes landed on a big encyclopedia book with a big encyclopedic book with a sunny beach on the cover. It would be nice to be on a sunny beach. Discovering Rio, an anthropological expedition. I feel like a Rio, I said. Very well. You are now and forever known as Rio. He reached into the bag at our feet and pulled out an old scroll. He held it open, revealing a sprawling chart of names and dates. To add your name to our family tree, you must prick a finger and place it there. He pointed to a spot next to 4 other names, all grouped under his own. He grabbed one of the silver needles and I let him pierce my finger. I pressed it in an empty space beside one of the names, Mia. The blood trembled and moved to form the letters of my new name. A whisper of wind blew through an open window, and a shiver ran down my spine. I hoped I'd made him happy. Cayenne moved to put me in the bed, and I clung to him. He laughed, a hearty, resonant laugh. It stirred something inside of me, sending heat to my face. Your devotion is beautiful, dearest Rio, but I have some things I must tend to before I sleep. See the sun rising through the curtains. It's already taking you. I pressed my face into the fine fabric of his jacket and closed my eyes. Take me with you. Please, Papa. Don't leave me. I yawned and snuggled closer against his chest. He inhaled and squeezed me in a strong hug before plopping me onto the bed. Standing over me, he beamed, a beautiful and majestic sight. I have business outside, Papa. You are still too weak to go out in daylight or to resist the sleep. Rest now, and I promise I will return before you wake again. He bent and brushed a tear away before kissing my cheek and tucking me under the blankets once again. My arms and legs stuck to the bed, tied down by an unseen force. I used the last of my strength crawling to him. My throat tightened, silencing my cries as he walked towards the door. Cayenne's voice rumbled across the darkened room. The porcelain dolls rattled against one another. When you rise tonight, I'll be right there in that chair, watching over you. Do not fret, my girl. The door clicked shut. Darkness. I felt Cayenne moving further and further down the hall. How strange it all seemed now. Strange that I should wake in the dark to his light and feel no fear. His footsteps echoed on the stone floors as I laid there, the weight that held my limbs down forcing my eyes to shut. I drifted, the desperate need to be near Cayenne fading with each moment. In the seconds before I lost consciousness, I wondered how he did it. How did he remove my fear and turn all of my questions into a forgotten moment? And why didn't that bother me? I took a deep breath and sighed, a smile lifting my cheeks. It doesn't matter. I'm his. I am going to take a very short break to pour some water into my glass because I maybe need some water. Okay. 2. Part 1, Chapter 2. The next evening, Cayenne watched me from the green chair just as he'd said. He greeted me with a glass of water and 2 pink tablets. I brought them to my mouth and stopped. What are these pills? Effusion Disome. They help your power grow. You'll take 2 a day until you're stronger. I feel strong already, Papa. He hesitated. We will see, sweet girl. Now get dressed for breakfast. I'll wait for you in the hall. He strolled out. The heavy wooden door slammed behind him. End of conversation. A set of clothes had been laid out on the end of the bed, cropped red pants and a white silken blouse. I dressed in a hurry, fluffed the matted coils on my head, and stepped out into a wide hall. If I didn't feel the plush carpet under my feet, I'd have sworn we were standing in a cave. A few candles flickered down the hall. Doors lined the walls on either side. I counted 6 as Cayenne led me past and on through large double doors. We emerged into a bright foyer at the top of a grand flight of stairs. I threw my arm over my face and spun to run back through the doors. Cayenne pulled me to him. Electric light. Your eyes will adjust, he said. Let's not keep them waiting. I blinked over and over until the stinging faded and I could see his face clearly. Then he guided me down the stairs and through another hall. Dozens of strange paintings covered the walls. We arrived at a huge dining room where a man and woman whispered to one another beside a long table in the center of the room. The woman's deep brown eyes widened when Cayenne and I stepped in. She seemed to float across the room towards us. Before I could react, She wrapped her arms around me and squeezed until my shoulders cracked aloud. "It's really you, my—" She pulled back and took my face in her hands, glancing at Cayenne. "My sister," she said. I could believe that. With her skin like black sapphire glowing under the light of a golden chandelier, she could be my younger sister. Although the similarity stopped there, for I had a mass of curls, she had long, jet-black hair that fell down her back like the darkest waterfall, and she stood at least a foot taller. She hugged me again and led me around the table to a seat near the end. The other man and Cayenne took their seats. Cayenne sat by me at the head of the table. The man and woman sat across from me. They stared, as still as stone, until I thought the silence would crush me. "I'm sorry. I don't remember your names." The woman pressed her lips into a tight smile. "Some of us are a bit hazy when we first awaken. I'm Tabitha, and this is Victor." She nodded to the man beside her. He was a veritable giant, standing heads over the rest of us, with white blonde hair that hung as long and straight as Tabitha's. He reached across the table and took my hand. He pressed it to his lips and gazed at me through intense diamond blue eyes. "Bienvenue." He leaned back in his chair and a lazy smile spread across his face. "Comment tu t'appelles?" To my surprise, I understood and responded in easy French. "My name is Rio." "That's an interesting one." He laughed, and Tabitha smiled at me. She'd opened her mouth to speak when another woman walked in. Or she had already been in the room. I wasn't sure. I didn't notice her until she placed a steaming plate of eggs and sausage in front of me. She seemed different from the others, smelled different. But why? She looked like us, with her chestnut brown hair piled atop her head, except that we all wore what appeared to be fine clothes, and she was clad in a plain brown smock and dirty apron. "This is Anna," Victor continued in his relaxed French. "She's the only house servant," Tabitha added in English. "She doesn't speak, so I guess that makes her good at keeping secrets." She shot the girl a dark look, then she beamed a smile at me as though I hadn't seen. "Sois gentille, mamie." Victor threw an arm around Tabitha's shoulder and pressed his forehead to hers, gazing into her eyes. For a moment, I thought they'd forgotten Cayenne and I were in the room. A whispering sound tickled at the back of my head as I watched them, and Tabitha glanced over at me. "You're too loud, my husband." She flashed Victor a conspiratorial smile. "She can't control her hearing yet." Anna finished laying plates in front of each of us and disappeared from the room. Before I could ask what Tabitha meant about my hearing, Cayenne pushed his chair back and stood. He twitched and a little red notebook materialized in his hand. I shifted back in my seat. Where did that come from? "The library." He grinned and lowered himself into his chair, handing me the book. "Your brother Yuri wanted to give this to you in person, but his flight was delayed." So there were more. Their names all matched the names in the scroll. I inspected the small spiral notebook. The one called Yuri had drawn an elaborate maze of roses on the cover, and I flipped to the first page. A familiar script scrawled neat across the page, bringing a warm feeling to my chest and a smile to my face. I didn't want to wait any longer, Cayenne said. Tabitha and Victor exchanged a look. Cayenne gazed at me. "It's a manual to help you acclimate to what we are." "And what are we, Papa?" It never occurred to me to ask until now. "We are Lilitu, so we aren't human." Tabitha reached across the table and grabbed my hand. We were once, all of us. Cayenne created, sired us and our whole family, just like you. Well, except for Samson, chérie, Victor added. Who's Samson? My breakfast companion smiled at me. No one said a word. If they were going to tell me, the moment was lost to a loud clamor in the hall. A young woman stumbled in, a lion's mane wild on her shoulders, and with a dark red something staining her gray top. The smell floated in with her the smell floating in with her dizzied me. Her bright red skin almost matched the color on her head. Out of the corner of my eye, I could see Cayenne's grip tighten on his fork. The young woman looked around, waiting for someone to speak. At first, everyone was quiet. After a few moments, Tabitha asked, "Have you been out in the sun?" The woman shrugged and walked over to a bar in the corner, close to another door that seemed to lead to the kitchen. Hi, baby. She poured a glass of bourbon and drank it down in 3 large gulps. Just the smell of it made my stomach turn. Cayenne spoke low, with a controlled tone, but his eyes darkened into a blackish green. "Mia," he said, "you're drunk and high." Mia shot him a cold gaze and narrowed her eyes. Does that make you angry, mein Herr? Do you even feel anger? Do you have any feelings at all? Cayenne's knuckles turned white as Tabitha jumped up and sped to Mia's side. "I think you might want to go to bed," she said, trying to guide Mia towards the door. "You're covered in blood." "Gesunte Fel. I will go where I want. I'm not sleepy." She shook Tabitha's hand from her shoulder and poured another drink, chugging it down even faster than the first. She looked at me, and in a flash she hovered inches from my face. My chest tightened as she studied me. Her sunburned face reddened further. Her teal eyes swam in red tears. I could almost hear her heart thumping behind the low-cut, blood-stained blouse, its deep V revealing that it wasn't just her face that burned. "Kukolny, you're not my sister," she hissed, spitting the aromas of bourbon and blood into my face. I trembled. Cayenne stood, slamming his hand on the table. Tabitha moved to Mia's side again, pulling her towards the door. "Let's get something to calm your skin, dear. We've got to cool you down." Red-tinted tears poured from Mia's eyes as she shook her head at Cayenne, then turned to Tabitha. She nodded and let the woman lead her away from the table and out of the room. A dark cloud surrounded Cayenne as he clenched his jaw. None of us moved or spoke for what felt like an eternity. Finally, Cayenne took a deep breath and pushed away from the table. I started to rise, and he placed a hand on my shoulder, planting me back in the chair. "Stay, my princess. Eat your breakfast. I have to go talk to our dear Mia." He looked at Victor, who nodded in agreement of something I couldn't understand. Then he kissed me on the forehead before walking towards the hall. Pausing on the way, he turned to me. "When you're done, Anna will help you to get dressed. I'd like to show you the whole estate today." Though I felt curious about what consequences Mia might face, a tremor of excitement traveled through my limbs as Cayenne left the room. It wasn't like she'd made the best first impression, and I was dying to see the rest of our home. I shoveled food into my mouth. Victor grabbed my hand mid-shovel. "Slow down, chérie. He won't leave you, and he'll probably be with Mia for a bit." He smiled at me, holding my hand. What did she say to me? "Cuccolini?" I asked. Kukulni. It means doll. That girl's just a little jealous. She'll get over it. Don't you fret. He glanced at Anna, who waited in the corner, and she rushed to clear the table. He watched her clean, inhaling deeply when she neared his face. I stuffed the last bites of savory sausage into my mouth. Even with such a large meal, my stomach churned for more. What does she have to be jealous of? Does Papa not love her or something? Victor chuckled. Something like that. We all have our different relationships with Kaya. She expected something else. I opened my mouth to respond, but he put up a hand to quiet me and cocked his head to the side as though listening. He grinned wide and moved around the table at astounding speed. In a blur he was by my side and pulling me to my feet. Where are we going? I pulled back as he practically dragged me into the hall and even further away from the bedrooms. He kept his grip light on my arm. I might have slipped out if I tugged hard enough. Instead, I let him lead me down the hall into a huge, colorful den. Golden frames surrounded large, full-color paintings on every wall. Plush furniture sporting lush red and purple velvets and silks filled the spacious room. Whoever decorated this house certainly had a flair for the dramatic. That would be your papa, little Rose. A young Asian man with wispy black hair smiled as we entered. In a second he stood in front of me. Welcome home, darling. He pulled me into his arms, a place my body remembered as I melted against him. You know me, sweet dear. I'm your brother, Yuri. Do you remember? The words echoed in my head with my voice, but I didn't think them. The young man uttered a lilting laugh and pulled me towards a deep purple sofa in the middle of the room. Victor's voice boomed behind us. I did not know you would be home so soon, Mampot. Yuri sat me down and turned to pull Victor into a hug. I tried calling you brother, but you were indisposed. He plopped on the couch beside me and wrapped an arm around my shoulder. After seeing why, I forgive you. He laughed and hugged me again. His voice filled the room with music, smooth and warm. As with the others, his beauty stunned me. I wrapped my arm around his small waist and looked up at his familiar face. He was hardly an inch taller than me, and hid a lithe figure under his loose, ruffled blouse. My brother. I'd never known love like the kind this family showed me. I knew, I knew I'd remember if I had. Part 1, Chapter 3. Victor's eyes trailed off to the corner. I followed his gaze to catch the silent servant Anna darting into a room behind a wall of bookshelves. Yuri noticed her too and shook his head at Victor. Or is she the reason you've been difficult to reach? Is the poison in her blood so hard to resist? Victor smirked and turned away to leave, but Yuri was in front of him in a flash. Don't try to speed away, brother. You may be older than me, but I'm faster. Victor's jaw twitched and he turned his head, refusing to make eye contact with either of us. Yuri winked at me and disappeared behind the shelves. In a few seconds he returned with Anna in tow. My, you've been naughty, little Anna. He laughed as she whimpered and tried to snatch her hand away. With that he pulled the girl into a sort of spinning dance, jerking her arm into the air and lifting her off her feet. He moved her like a doll, despite the fact she stood at least 3 inches taller than him. She let out a small whine and he released her. Her body slammed into the wall as she clutched her already bruising wrist. Yuri cackled as I ran to the girl. She leaned heavy against the wall, holding her wrist to her chest with closed eyes. I reached for Anna's hand and she hid it behind her back, shaking her head and moving away. She looked down at her feet and then scampered towards the door at the back of the room. Oh, I was just playing with her. He flopped back onto the couch and crossed his arms. She's not afraid of us. She's afraid of getting in trouble. Right, Vic? Victor sucked his teeth. He stood with his hands in the pockets of his cream-colored slacks, shoulders squared. A dark shadow settled on his face. I sensed more here than either said. That was foolish, mon frere, Victor growled before flashing out after the girl. I glared at Yuri, pointing at the door behind him. What the hell was that? You could have broken her arm. I very well may have, he chuckled. Your humanity is endearing, little Rose, but it's time to let go of those inclinations. Humans are practically cattle. Anna may be one of our favorites, but she's still no more than a servant, at least to some of us. He leaned on the back of a large red chair, inspecting his nails. My fists clenched. Well, excuse me. I didn't know Lilitu was synonymous with bully. I don't think she's cattle. I snapped at him. And I don't think our papa, your papa, Rio, you're the only daughter he has. To me, he's more of a lifelong friend. He rolled his eyes and yawned, standing to stretch. Cayenne didn't sire you? I asked. Oh, he did, pet. He sired all of us, or most anyway. But we enjoyed each other's company when I was human. He worked with my father, a feudal lord in Mito. We grew close, and by the time I hit 22, I knew I wanted him to share his gift with me. Of course, we aren't as close these days. He walked towards one of the bookshelves lining the wall and ran his finger across the spines. A feudal lord. I scrunched my nose. He still looked 22. How old are you? I made 191 just last week. I was celebrating in Peru when I heard you'd come home. He pulled a tattered old book off the shelf and tossed it over me. Read this. It's about a man who's immortal and beautiful like us. At least he is, so long as he keeps the painting safe. I think you'll like him. I set the book beside me, more interested in our own history than fiction. Right. I suppose Lilitu don't age. Cayenne did say he's much older than he looks. My own age was a mystery to me, yet somehow it seemed unimportant. I looked up at Yuri as he leaned against the bookshelf. What was Cayenne like before? Oh, he was divine, Yuri sighed. Imagine what you felt when you first saw him. Now imagine being human and feeling that way all the time. He blushed and looked away. He had to know I had no memory of any life before this, no memory of what it meant to be human. A scream cut through the awkward silence between us. A man's voice outside. Yuri and I ran through the heavy front double door. Large snow clusters fell on a forest of silvery white and black trees across a wide courtyard. How strange that Cayenne built this house facing the woods. In the distance, a man, a human if the smell of blood and urine was any clue, in a gray business suit stumbled from the darkness of the trees, holding his left shoulder. Dirt and twigs fell around him as he looked towards us in horror. He broke into a mad sprint at us, and I ran to meet him. Whatever the matter, he needed help. His eyes widened as he glanced behind me, then he pivoted back towards the woods. A low growl emanated from the forest. Wait, I called to him, but Yuri's hand clamped on my shoulder, preventing me from getting closer. A pack of howling wolves emerged from the darkness, chasing and surrounding him. They snapped and snarled at him, and I froze, mesmerized by the steam rising from their thick, hot saliva hitting the snow. Spellbound. The man cowered in the center, yelling for help. No help came. His eyes grew large as he looked past the beasts, and I couldn't tell if the loud drumming in my ears was his heart or mine. Another man bounded from the top of a tree, one hand securing a black, wide-brimmed hat to his head. With his other hand, he grabbed the horrified young man's throat and lifted him above his head. Whew! You gave me a good run, boy. I'll bet you're just marinating in adrenaline. His accent drawled so that it seemed he never pronounced the last part of his words. I'm going to enjoy this. The human struggled in his hand, but found that useless and the grip unbreakable. He cried as steaming liquid poured out of his pant leg. The man in the hat peered up at his prey, laughing as he pleaded for his life. Then he turned and grinned, looking right into my eyes. Hey there, princess. He laughed and tilted his head back, opening his mouth wide to flash 6 sharp points for both me and his victim before using them to rip into the man's neck. Blood splashed bright red on virgin white snow. It poured down the front of his suit in gushing spurts. Okay, I think I am going to stop there because my throat is no longer happy with me for doing this. And it's been about an hour, so that's pretty good timing. But if you're watching this at any point in time, I'll see you tomorrow. And thanks for being here. Have a beautiful night. Bye.